this, man. You like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's always hanging on.
All right, Marcus, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Hello, man. And firstly, just first cap off the rank, that intro is superb. Quite captivating, actually. Because I mean, this is the thing. I think you and I did 2 shows quite early on in the piece, right, when you were doing these streams 1-to-1, and you and I haven't talked for, I would say, at least a year, if not 18 months, right? And so, I haven't seen the intro, and it's actually quite amazing. So, well, it's in like a listener sort of like watching it come on. So it's splendid upgrade. The old one was lovely too, but like that's really kind of captivating.
Well, here's the thing. The first one, actually not the first one. There've been several. The previous theme song was actually royalty-free music that I sort of messed with. Right, I added some additional audio, and then had a video package made. And I didn't realize this. I fell for a common scam where they will have something labeled as royalty-free, which is not. What they're doing is not collecting royalties. And then a year or 2 later, they'll start enforcing it. So all of a sudden, everything...
The delayed yoink, as they called it.
Exactly. Everything I'd used that audio on, which was like 150 episodes. It was a lot. Man. Got hit all at once for copyright. So they just stole all the dozens of dollars of YouTube monetization that I was getting on those. And so out of spite, I basically was like, no, I'm turning off monetization on everything that intro is connected to. And also, I had one of my buddies who's a pretty decent music producer come up with that track for me, which I really like. He really went all in. Like, if you're wearing nice headphones, you can see he does all kinds of crazy stuff with audio panning. It's a ton of fun. But maybe this is a tease, but I've actually got a new one in the works. Probably gonna do a little bit of a rebrand now that I am out and proud as a face lord, right? The appropriate term for that. But yeah, man. So I really like that intro. It's me and him made it together, and we're just like giggling.
Well, hopefully
like
next time we chat, I don't like miss a whole intro phase, and like we'll be talking like 2 intros later. It's like, oh, by the way, Bert, last like 18 months have been really cool, man. But so much has happened, and by the way, I missed your intro. Anyway,
yeah, really. Well, dude, we've been somehow talking for almost an hour, which I think is what happened last time too. That we either had we recorded.
Oh wow, Furious doesn't shut his mouth. What's new?
That's why I bring you on.
Sorry, continue. Yeah, indeed.
But we had an entire conversation about the chemicals that are turning the frogs gay, which is kind of a joke, kind of not.
Frogs gay. Yeah.
I became aware of this because I live in an infamously polluted watershed. It's getting better, but I'll put it this way. Everyone who lives around me knows you don't eat the fish after a certain point because sometimes you get a 2-for-1 special, right? A fish with 2 heads and 1 body, or other kind of Fallout-esque mutations. And so you were saying that you went on kind of a deep dive about Teflon, right? These forever chemicals.
Well, not so much kind of a deep dive, but I suppose in fairness to both of us, as friends do, oh, dude, how you going? Yada, yada, yada. And we sort of, as I'm sure most of your viewers know, or some of them know, and certainly our mutual friends know. Like I'm from farming stock here in Australia. My family's farmed here for 60 odd years, and my father and I have just, in the last couple of years of transition from.
Marcus, what world event, roughly 60 to 80 years ago, would have prompted
no
diaspora of Italians?
Well, let's put it this way: the same people who bombed the facilities in Iran were the same people who bombed Monte Cassino. Let's just say that. And sadly for my grandfather, because he was actually the eldest of his siblings, he when he arrived back home, he commented. Well, he told anyone who asked him, he's like, basically the southern Lazio from Terracina all the way to north of Naples just resembled the surface of the moon. There's craters everywhere.
Well, this is actually a theme in one of my favorite books. Have you ever read Catch-22?
I have not. No.
It's quite good. It's kind of funny. It's one of the many books that is sort of ruined by the people that like it. It was sort of somewhat similar to damn it, what's the name of it? Whatever. It's one of several books that a lot of the sort of retarded anti-war leftists of the 60s really liked, but it's actually quite good. And it's sort of this like non-linear narrative of a guy who is the commander of a bomber over Italy. And again, quite interesting. There's obviously the main narrative, but in the background, you see the absolute devastation of the raids on Italy. And weirdly enough, actually, the town of Orvieto, which was not bombed, features quite prominently as sort of an AA defense location, right? They had a lot of anti-air up there, which sort of sets the plot in motion. But anyway, sorry, enough of me just rambling about random.
No. That's interesting. I actually didn't know that about Orvieto. It's actually quite interesting. That there obviously would have been defensive hardpoints, because for anyone who actually has, I know that this is meant to be history stream necessarily, but for anyone with like a rudimentary understanding of World War II history writ large, but of the Italian theatre as well, is that the Italian theatre, the defence of which by the German forces in World War II was sort of conducted in a very gradual and in a highly organised and, I dare say, disciplined manner. I mean, in no point in time, I don't think that the Germans ever had more than sort of 14, 15 divisions in Italy, certainly not along the front line. And were often fighting at a material and manpower disadvantage to the Allies. At any point in time, they'd be outnumbered 2-1, and the Allies would have a preponderance of artillery in anywhere of the order of 3-1, 5-1, 8-1. It was almost Eastern Front levels. I mean, not quite Eastern Front levels. I mean, there are certain offensives in the East you sort of read about where the Soviets have like a 12-1 advantage in tanks and a 15-1 advantage in artillery. You just think, how the hell did anybody survive? But nonetheless, too, like obviously the Allies, having big navies as well, they utilize naval artillery from cruisers and battleships, and they had a hard time defending Italy. But because of Italy's natural topography, it's quite conducive to defensive warfare. And if anyone is sort of familiar with the assaults at Salerno or Anzio, the defense of Monte Cassino, the Gustav Line, the Gothic Line, these battles all the way up the Italian peninsula, I mean, it was conducive to defensive warfare. So the fact that the Germans would set up these hard points is not surprising. Well, nor would it be surprising it would be part of a plot device, if you get what I mean.
Well, and it's sort of interesting because, again, the actual geography of that area of Italy, there is these, what we would call in the American West, like these like mesas, right? These tabletops, which are, not to get too into it, but formed where there's kind of a very soft stone, and then underneath it, this sort of like, lava bubbling up, right? That forms these kind of like hard pillars. And even going back to the Etruscans, these were hard points, obviously incredibly defensible. It's sort of this like natural, just tabletop of stone, rising out of the valley. And so, there are a couple of them, and all of them have been occupied for as long as Italy has been occupied. And so, it's quite common. You have this sort of like multi-layer stacking of different civilizations, one on top of the other. So you have an Etruscan temple, a Roman one, and then 3 different Christian churches, all built one on top of the other.
And often like one has collapsed due to an earthquake, so they've rebuilt it, but it's got like 3 foundations below it, sort of thing.
Well, and especially, let's be honest, the fact that a large portion of the rock is either like limestone or pumice, which is not particularly good for building on top of it. Features.
But funny you mention the Etruscans, because in a sense, what you've described is in essence is how the Romans described the Samnite Wars, because the Romans fought 3 conflicts with the Samnites. I talk about this with Bo, actually, History Bro, great channel everyone should follow and subscribe. We've got a 2-hour stream where we were meant to canvas, I think, what was it? Pre Greek War or Macedonian War history, and we barely got to Pyrrhus. I don't think we didn't even get to Pyrrhus. Like we just did the early Republic. I think we only canvassed like half of it, but we actually spoke about this, and in essence, one of the great sort of not really apocryphal, because we do strongly believe that it happened, but like the Second Samnite War, the Samnites actually surround the Romans in one of these sort of like sort of plateau suppressions, where sort of like you have this high rise on like this sort of bit of a sort of a granite plateau, but then either side of it is, to use a word like bocage, or like rock breakers around it, and the Romans sort of march their army through, and then the Samnites block off one entry and they block off the other entry, and then there's a whole sort of palaver about the Romans trying to extricate themselves out of the scenario, and it's actually one of the reasons why the Romans completely changed their fighting style. They go from like a Greek style phalanx to sort of creating what we understand as the maniple. It's where like the origin of the legionnaire begins, because it's like, well, we can't use blocks of spears with all these mountains. It just doesn't work. Yeah.
Well, it's also sort of an interesting historical note that sort of layered effect was in some cases sort of retarded, right? There were gaps in it because at least in some of the areas, the Romans actually salted the ground, which means that it took a very long time for those areas to be suitable for human habitation. So you can sort of have these like multi-100-year gaps where no one wanted to live there because it was a blasted hellscape. And then, eventually the salt goes away. I'm not an ecologist. I don't know how it works. Magic, we'll say. And then it sort of resumes, with this gap, which is kind of an interesting thing as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you remember when we were talking about chemicals 10 minutes ago?
Yes, that's right. Well, it was actually funny because, like, as we know, the Romans are expert hydrologists as well. But yes, anyway, we were chatting previous to pressing record, and we're talking about farming and stuff. And I sort of said to you that, interspersed with all the various things that come across my YouTube timeline, I actually watched a documentary about Teflon. Because, for those of us who are mutual friends and peers and all that, sort of know that I'm in that sort of, I'm not technically actually carnivore, but I sort of like lean quite heavy into keto, and part of my eating and general life regime. I wouldn't call myself a Puritan, but I mean that's what I mostly do with my life. And so these topics obviously interest me, and we have there's a couple of I can't remember if they were Deepest Laws. I think they were Deepest Laws on AA's channel regarding like the vegan agenda and the meat-free diet and the sort of stuff pertaining to that. And we sort of touched on this stuff a little bit, but yeah, obviously like us sort of based chuds obviously try to avoid the slop and the plastics and all that sort of stuff, which is actually, funnily enough, since we did those streams, it's become a more prevalent talking point even in our circles, but also in wider society. And of course,
it's been mainstreamed. This was something I was talking about with John Moody, who's sort of an old head in the shall we say the natural food space. And I was really interested in talking to him about it because he was saying when he got into it 20 years ago, it was basically disgusting hippies, people who don't shower very much and have, strong opinions on crystals and free love and the like. And so he was sort of an early adopter.
Deodorant avoidant and all that sort of stuff.
Sort of an early adopter as someone who was, had a large family, was quite religious, conservative. But that trend has massively accelerated. And it's actually been interesting. One of the things I often talk about that's weird and gay about modern politics is that all of these sort of ancillary details have become political signifiers, right? Like even down to like, your vices or your hobbies are. But one of the most interesting ones is caring about food has become extremely like right-wing or conspiracy coded. And, I'm a raw milk enjoyer. And if people find out about it, it's sort of like a smoking gun. It's like, what have you done? Like, there's something wrong with you. You're one of these dangerous conspiracy theory freaks. And I've actually been lectured on this by a...
It's like, dude, you're like an RFK Republican,
Yeah, it's like, if you only knew. If you only knew.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I'm sort of in the same boat as well. I mean, I often, like, whenever I catch up with people IRL and have a chat, whatever, I sort of tell them like my kombucha. Well, it's not really a joke, but it's actually cafes now closed down, so they're not around anymore. But like the number of times that their waitresses who would like just start working there would because I'm quite partial to kombucha. I like kombucha, and kombucha is one of those things that like there's really bad kombucha, and then there's actually quite nice kombucha, and I tend to
it's
enjoy
like anything
nice
else
one.
Fermented, right?
Of course, yeah.
My wife is a big fermenter, and
nice.
There's a right and a wrong way to do it, and especially because
big time.
kombucha is sort of like baby's first fermenting. You get a lot of you get a lot of some batches are a little bit off and taste like if you can imagine if you soak your boots in vinegar, it sort of tastes like that.
It can taste like how one imagines like athlete's foot to smell. Like it's
yes, exactly.
It's exactly right. If you could imagine it having a taste, it'd be that. Yeah, exactly. So and often like the new waitress would be like, oh, so are you into like Greens politics? It's like, oh, sweetheart, if only you knew where this where this food origin story resides.
Sweet summer child.
Exactly, because it's often women who like say that they make the observation. It's like, oh, this person must be left wing. It's like, oh my lord.
Well, and it's interesting. You see the same.
We both hate John McCain, but for very different reasons.
I mean, and in reverse, it's been sort of interesting to see the degree to which big pharma and big ag have been so thoroughly whitewashed in mainstream culture.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you guys have Monsanto, but Monsanto was synonymous with the devil for a solid like 10 to 15 years, even to the point where there's a very famous documentary, Food Inc., which is all about, the excesses of, American factory farming. And it's particularly interesting because it's sort of out of date now. I think it was late George Bush, maybe like 06, 07 when it came out. But it's very much liberal coded.
Back when he was like disliked by sort of polite society, right? Before
before he was the painting grandpa, he was a war criminal. But either way, it's very, very liberal left wing coded, and there's this air of moral superiority, like, oh, the stupid chuds just shoveling their slop, and it's funny to see that out of context because you're like, wait a minute, this same guy is lecturing me about, Beyond Meat and how I need to have, only the most hyper pasteurized products or else I'm going to die. It's just interesting to see how much of that was pure political signaling, not necessarily an actual sort of care for the environment or for health.
It wasn't a conviction based on sort of like any kind of solid rationale. And, I hate to use, because I guess with what we've been through in the last 5 years, there's a reticence talking about, but the studies show and yada, yada, yada. But, we are seeing at least, more than anecdotally, but I think the anecdotes are even enough to sort of see the number of people who simply can't sustain like a vegan diet, say, or who, don't thrive on vegetarianism, or people who tend to flip, often in one direction rather than the other. Like I've seen very few steak lovers, like give up steak with great enthusiasm. Meanwhile, there are people who just fall off the vegan bandwagon in like a state of perpetual agony. Actually, funnily enough, just before we started, I watched this. I don't know why it came up on my phone, but there was a news headline that's something about Leanne Rimes, like her teeth fell out because like prior to like a concert that she did last night, and she's been like a vegan for like 15, 20 years. I'm like, oh well, that's what happens when you can't synthesize collagen, sweetheart. Like you start falling apart. Like, sorry to say.
Well, honestly, I think that veganism is sort of a different thing, where it's almost more of like a Puritanism or a desire to be kind of holier thou and cleaner than everyone else.
Very much so. Very much
like
so.
You see this with artists like Moby, right?
Yes.
He did. I think he did the theme song to the Bourne movies, and then a few other kind of electronic hits from the late 90s, early 2000s.
And for those of us old enough, the intro song to Gone in 50 Seconds. But anyway, I'm showing my age now.
Ages ago, just 1 foot in the grave, Marcus.
Sorry, continue.
No. Point is,
like, repulsive food activist. Yes,
right. And it seems to me that the interest, the stated goal is health or animal rights or anything, but the sort of primary motivation is I get to be better than you. And I think you see a similar thing in the eco movement where, and there are notable exceptions to this. Like I love sort of, crunchy hippie people. They're, fun to be around. And many of those people are quite committed to what they do. But a lot of it and particularly you see this, I mean, I guess before Elon Musk sort of associated himself so strongly with Donald Trump around things like electric cars or solar power, where it is much more about, I am signaling that I am a high class person who can afford this and is better than you, than any actual care for the environment. Because like one of the things I think about,
stroke also intellectual superiority, because you know it's not arrogant, well arrogant, but it's the dim-witted, dense, ill-educated chuds who shovel the coal and eat the hot dog and grill the steak. It's very much plays into that stereotype of the rube, as you guys would call them.
Oh, definitely. And food is always a class signifier. That you see that sort of throughout human societies. Mm-hmm. But the post hoc rationalization almost doesn't matter, because when I was a kid in the early 2000s, it was all about Whole Foods and things like that were seen as sort of prestigious. I think Forks Over Knives was a quite popular book about obviously eating lots of leafy greens. And that segment of society still exists, but it has moved over to hyper-processed industrial slop that is technically plant-based, for as much as that term means.
They're drinking Soylent in the seats of their EVs now, you might say.
Yeah. Well, and there's no better example of this, and this has kind of died out, but for a while in kind of mid-Biden admin, do you remember the whole uproar around gas stoves?
Yes. Yeah, I do. Because actually, the reason I know that is because they in Australia, I think in Victoria, which is the state where Melbourne resides, it's on the southeast coast of Australia. I believe the state government either attempted to or successfully passed a mandate whereby I think new houses constructed, I think, not to misinfo myself, but somewhere around 2028 or 2029, they could no longer be constructed with gas stoves. And by gas stoves, we actually mean it would be illegal to place the gas piping in the houses for them to utilize gas, in essence.
Which
yeah, exactly. And I believe the Biden had been trying to do similar, right?
Which of course is totally absurd. As someone who has recently moved from a house with electric burners to gas ones, gas ones are clearly better. It makes everything better. It's much, if you care about preparing food, it is clearly a superior technology. But again, and the funny thing is, 20 years ago, that was a sign that you were a cosmopolitan person who cared about cooking. It was a high class signifier. And as soon as the incentives shift, as soon as power signals something different, well, guess what? That's something for gross chuds. And so it almost doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right? You can imagine any, almost any outcome, and that segment of society would swap.
You know what's just came to mind? I know it's a bit of a deviation from what we're discussing, but just because we're on the topic of gas. Do you remember?
Mark, you say that like this isn't a massive deviation from the subject that we didn't establish before we planned this episode.
I know, right? We still actually haven't. We actually still haven't touched on Teflon yet. But anyway, for the tangent, right? Do you remember at the very beginning of the outbreak of the Donbass war, right? When Europeans, oh my god, the gas is cut off, we're gonna freeze to death, whatever. There was some Chad Russian dipshit, but funniest thing ever, where he just one day lights the gas up on his stove, leaves the burner running, puts a camera in front of it, and just collected super chats, and was constantly was constantly just dabbing on the Euro pause who are gonna freeze forever. And I'm not one of those people I don't like to crap on the Europeans, right? That's just not my thing. But just some dude found a way to monetize just having endless supply from Gazprom. That is the funniest flex I've ever seen in my life.
Well, at a certain
do you remember
point,
that, Bowden?
Oh yeah. Well, at a certain point, you just have to give someone credit for being that much of a hater. This has always been my point on
cheating
50
the
Cent.
system.
Yeah. 50 Cent, the rapper. And look, I'm not a huge hip hop guy, but the fact that he has been for decades calling out Sean Diddy Combs as exactly what he was, and has spent decades in the public view just making fun of this guy for being a gay rapist.
Meanwhile,
And it has just been the smuggest man on the planet ever since it came out. Just saying, again, like stupid, petty things. But at the same time, you're like, you know what? I don't really care about this. This isn't my fight at all. But I have to respect the sheer spite that motivated this. Yeah.
Exactly. But no, you're quite right about like, to sort of wheel back one tangent. You're right about the whole signifier thing, and someone who's actually as you guys know, I've a passion for sort of cooking and cuisine as sort of like at a point in time in a past life, an occupation of mine. That there's a reason why most restaurants and cafes and commercial kitchens run gas. It is much more versatile, quite useful. And I mean, I'll put it this way, I'm someone who actually does utilize induction domestically. I actually quite like induction for certain purposes. But in the end, if you're going to be someone who enjoys cooking cuisine, you're going to be utilizing gas. And the other thing as well, it's because I think you and I, from what we've obviously, shot the shit personally and, not recording, whatever. We obviously both share a love of motoring, and we'll probably touch on that at some point today, hopefully, because we've missed it the last 2 times. Is that gas is a bit like internal combustion in the motor car. In one way, it was one of the most, and when I use the word liberating, I don't mean it from like the civil rights kind of, egalitarian, Horkheimer, Frankfurt School sense of what being liberal means, but in the sense that a free, law-abiding citizen could get in the car and drive without impediment, right? That's actually freedom in the sort of you might say the true Greek city-state Aristotelian sense. And the idea that you could just turn, if you had a free supply of gas to your house and, you paid your utility bills, etc., you could have gas at the turn of a button and be able to cook in your house or heat up water or do whatever. And, you had this, because let's face it, gas is a hugely abundant resource on the planet, in the world, to the point where international transactions of gas, I mean, I say this as an Australian, we send ungodly quantities of gas to China every year, pennies on the dime. And you would not do that with a resource which was rare or exclusive or hard to come by. There's plentiful gas reserves around the world. And so gas as being one of the things, and cheap energy writ large, is one of the things that actually truly frees people, in a sense, to go about their lives in an unimpeded fashion. And there is a very clear reason, and it highlights the malevolence of our, shall I say, ideological opposition as to why they wish to curtail that, which is the same reason also they want to make internal combustion unfashionable and to price it out to the point where you're looking at major cities essentially illegalizing the sale of new internal combustion cars sort of by 2030 or so. But it's becoming so unfeasible now, as we're seeing with the collapse of the EV agenda, that they simply can't supplant the motor car with EVs. They're going to struggle to do it with hybrids. And it's just an attack on Joe Citizen, really. And it's a way of just making our lives more miserable and less abundant. And just to have, it's yet another way to empower the finger-wagging, insufferable harridans who seek to control our lives, and not for the better.
And that's sort of just undirected malice. We were talking earlier about water filters, and due to the, shall we say, the industry concerns in my area,
we'll get back to Teflon eventually.
One might come hell or high water, but because of that, right? My wife and I own a fairly large, expensive filter, and one of the interesting things about that is it's we have the unit, but it's become quite difficult to purchase new filters for it because the Biden administration, and really like the closing months of his presidency, basically made producing those filters illegal for literally no reason. Right? There was some sort of fig leaf about chlorine used in the manufacturing process.
Just as a personal curiosity, sorry, just as a non-American, is that something that is implemented by the FDA, or is there another means of that being brought into reality?
I think it was the FDA. It might have been HHS. I can't remember which.
So one of the two.
Godless bureaucracy.
Yeah.
But point is, it was basically people we don't like this thing, so we're going to make it illegal, which you see all the time. Like you see this with gun politics in America.
Mm-hmm.
Like really, if you actually cared about reducing the murder rate, what you would go after is cheap, semi-disposable handguns. Effectively,
and policing the communities in which this violence disproportionately occurs. Let's face it.
100%. If you dig into the numbers, we basically, in a country of 350 million people, roughly 17 to 25 people are killed with rifles every year, which is obviously, I don't want those people to be dead, but that includes hunting accidents, crimes of passion,
incidentals. Yeah,
exactly, right. Which I hate to say it, is in the grand scheme of things not a problem when you have a country of 330 million people.
Well, maybe not a problem is not the right way to term, but it's one of those things that in a society of people where people make choices and have freedoms and what have you, like these things happen. And the idea of a just government is to have that at as naturally low rate as is feasibly possible without impinging on freedoms.
Of course. Right? And I obviously, murder is a bad thing. And I hope that every one of those people is punished to the fullest extent of the law.
Correct.
But when you contextualize that to the American murder rate writ large, which is quite high for the developed world, it is basically these kind of cheap, semi-disposable handguns. And yet, again, what is the anti-gun lobby focused on? Basically, it's things that chuds like. It's a lot of things that don't meaningfully
shotguns, long arms,
lethality, but are what people who are passionate about guns use. Correct. And so effectively, it is, again, another case of this spite. But you 100% see the same thing with cars. What the EPA has done to diesel engines, like we need a Nuremberg type event to set that right, because it is criminal. They've basically mandated these engines destroy themselves with like exhaust gas recirculation and DEF and all of these stupid, technically, emissions friendly things. And look, man, like,
because they weren't choked enough in the 80s, right? Like with the California laws.
Right. And again, like my favorite example of this is, every once in a while the leftists will discover how big American trucks are and get really upset about it. Like, this is a people muncher. It's taller than this 5-year-old. We should ban them. These people are literally too dumb to realize this is the direct result of their policies, which, of course, many such cases, this is the whole story of America for the last 80 years.
Trucks have grown bigger to fulfill, as have cars and SUVs, to fulfill ever-tightening constrictions on design because of overregulation, dipshits.
Yes, literally. This is, again, Obama destroyed the car market in the U.S. with two things. One, these CAFE regulations, and two, with cash for clunkers, which was just a genocide of used cars. He basically offered
wonderful old analog cars that people will never see the light of day again.
Well, I mean, look, man, like I'll put it this way. I bought my first car in 2016. And you can track this over time. The price of used cars before and after Obama is like a tabletop. It shot up. Because traditionally what you do is you get your teenager, a 10 to 20-year-old Honda or something, right? That was cheap and cheerful, unlikely to kill them, basically reliable.
I do feel like there was like a 15-year period where every high schooler like wound up with either like a mid-80s Chevrolet or like a late 80s, early 90s like Honda Civic or something. Like
100%.
Everyone went through that phase,
And all of those got turned in for gift cards, right? It was a kind of a sliding scale from 5 to 3,000.
Well, people who came from families where it's like, you would get handed down to a sibling or sold to a cousin or like the neighbor or something,
Right. And that just, as you can imagine, when you restrict the supply, it destroyed used cars. Now add on top of that, several like tens of millions of uninvited guests who don't necessarily have, shall we say, the financials to buy a new car, but they have cash. And man, like you cannot buy a decent truck, like a work vehicle in America for really under 15 grand. It's absurd. Absolutely absurd.
Yeah, it's not too dissimilar here actually, because I was because my dad and I have been needing a secondary work vehicle, what you guys would call a pickup, what we call a ute, but same thing. Because we've been quite, as you know, Australians are very fond of like their Land Cruisers and Hiluxes and that sort of stuff. And you just go on any used car application, like, website or whatever, and ones that are cheap are just run down buckets of garbage. And if you're running a business, you just can't afford that. You need something that is a reliable and functional, work asset essentially. And then anything that's sort of well looked after, relatively low mileage, etc. You're paying, well, it's about the equivalent that you said, about 15,000 American, which is about 35,000 Australian. I mean, it's the same deal. It's just, I mean, I'm not going to say it's impossible if you're from a relatively decent, domestic financial situation, but that prices a lot of people out of the market. It prices a lot of them out of the market. And also too, it's another thing whereby noticing quite a change in sort of like car culture as well, where, I mean, I can't speak for you, but maybe you've got a similar or different story, but same in my case, like all me and my friends grew up, driving manual transmissions and, driving our work vehicles on our local farms. And even like our city friends would, because the cheap cars would often have either really shoddy automatic transmissions. And for anyone who's driven an automatic that was made before 2000 or 2005, you know exactly what we're on about, or they were manuals. And often people would like save a bit of money because often on like a resale or a what do you call it? Not a transfer. There's a word for it. I'm just going blank. A trade-in. The manuals would usually discount, and you had a plethora of people who actually had. I use the word competence loosely because most people are actually pretty horrible drivers in society, but they would actually have the ability to operate a manual transmission. Whereas it's like now, like literally the Zoomers, in the event they are getting driver's license, they're getting exclusively automatic licenses, to the point where like a lot of manufacturers aren't even making H-pattern gearboxes anymore. And for anyone who actually has a liking for cars, and I don't know, like, I know you and I enjoy this as a subject. I don't know how many of our friends are into sort of cars or such, but if you are actually passionate
Marcus,
about cars, you will decry the death of the H-pattern gearbox, the stick shift, as you guys call them.
Well, you're 100% correct. And I just want to brief aside. I have a disdain for my audience. Their interests, unrelated to what I will release episodes on. If I did another episode, if I asked if I should do another episode about gun autism or cars, 95% no. And I still keep doing them, and they keep watching, just like pigs eating their slop. They don't even have the command of themselves to say no. Just absolute scum. Listens to
warning to Jay Burton's audience. The next time I come on this show, I will do a blow for blow, race for race review of the 2000 Formula One season.
I actually read into this
in painstaking, excruciating detail. Don't you worry.
It turns out that I found this out the other day. Women are not at all interested in a similar blow-by-blow recounting of Nick Diaz's entire UFC run.
Wow.
And nonetheless, that information is in my brain. But to your point about manuals, it's sort of, there's another issue as well, which is as the amount of regulation has increased the price of new cars, it has also shifted the average buyer of new cars to being older and older and more wealthy. And you see this in the ballooning sticker price of different models. So it used to be, right, that like a Golf GTI was sort of like an entry level, practical sports car, right? A hot hatch, sort of something you would get with your first real job. So for instance, like I think that when the Mark V came out, right, it was a 2-liter turbo, 6-speed, might have been a 1.8 the first year, but who cares? Either way, right, that was about $23,000. And let me pull up a converter.
And it's a lot of car. You think about it, it would have had a DSG gearbox. I mean, by that point, cars had like all electrics, windows, seats. That stuff was very commonplace by then. I mean,
right,
it's not like just as a quick. Sorry, go on, and I'll tell my anecdote after. Sorry, go on.
Well, and so, sorry, give me a second, Bird.
Well, while you're searching that, I'll share my anecdote. I remember the first year I was at high school, and we had a lady there. She was kind of like, not. She wasn't a cleaning lady. She wasn't a nurse, but she was like in like the sick bay, and she kind of like did like, aftercare for the boys kind of thing, right? And she drove a 1984 Ford, right? Like it was a Ford Australia model. I don't think it was a Cortina, but anyway. And she said that it was her and her husband's first car that they bought when they were married, and like, you know, by this point she was already like a 50-something-year-old, 55, 60-year-old lady, right? You're talking 20 odd years ago now, and they had to pick between power steering and air conditioning. Now, if you live anywhere sort of like off the north of the south coast of Australia, you're not going to want to live here without air conditioning. Like, you've got, you know, it's like, oh, I'm going to live in Arizona or New Mexico without air conditioning. Forget it, right? So she went without power steering. And like back then, people used to make those judgment calls. You know, it's like, yes, I will pick the air conditioning over the power steering. So this old like 80s Ford Cortina had no power steering.
Well,
and that little lady, she was only like 5'2", but God, she used to turn that steering wheel. She got in and out of the car park every day of the week.
Well, and to the point about, you know, car inflation, that GTI is basically increased in real terms by $10,000, right? Like that's a 25% price increase for a similarly optioned car.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, that changes the consumer, because all of a sudden, you know, that's not a product designed for, you know, a single guy in his early 20s with a decent job, or you know, it's not designed for, you know, sort of young professionals anymore. That is a car for middle-aged people. And so again, things get bigger and taller so they can accommodate.
When the kids move out of home, like, you know, if dad wants to buy like a city runabout, he's buying a new GTI now because he can.
Right. And of course, that dad is, you know, 60 to 70. And so he wants a car that is old people friendly. And so the reason these crossovers have, you know, really exploded is because they're good for old people. And, you know, when you look back at the kind of the heyday of, you know, the American muscle cars, right, which, you know, aren't necessarily my cup of tea, but are still quite interesting. There was a very real, and part of this is because the boomers were young then, right? So there was a large, you know, youth market, but there was a spread of different models, right? The idea is that, you know, you'd start off in sort of a, you know, a base model Chevrolet, and then over the course of your life, you know, work up.
You couldn't buy a Corvette, so you started with a Chevelle, right?
Right, yeah, and then you'd sort of move up to, you know, an Oldsmobile when you were a little bit older, and then when you were, you know, wealthy later in life, you'd get a Cadillac. Actually, speaking of this, is completely off the track that we were supposed to be on, but no manufacturer, and I'm so sad they're done with it, was more just mangled than Oldsmobile and Buick, because they used to make the coolest stuff in the 60s. Like an Olds 88 is just a really pretty car, and again, they were like mid-market. And to see a time in which, like, even, you know, kind of like dreary cars for kind of, you know, normal people with normal jobs were well designed and had kind of cool, you know, unique features. Like, it really speaks to a time when culture was more confident, right? When everything wasn't purely like an appliance.
And also too, there's like this sort of intersection between flair and art, but then also mechanics and like, or maybe not mechanics, but like techniques and like engineering. And I kind of feel that whether you're talking about, you know, like I'm trying to think, what was that? Was it a Chrysler, the 56, and it had like air suspension? You know, it was like outrageous for its day. You know, it had like, I can't remember, it was like some kind of electric feature like cruise control or something, but it was like in the 50s, was unheard of. You know, the E-type Jag from like the early mid 60s was the first car to be made with all-round disc brakes. And had independent suspension.
Marcus, I mean, have I ever told you the story of how I broke an E-type?
No, you haven't.
This is an awful story.
Oh my God, how the hell did you break an E-type? My God.
It was an original unrestored E-type coupe, right? The hardtop.
Well, the fact that's unrestored, I feel would be better now. Like, at least someone might fix it.
Well, that's the thing though. The unrestored ones are worth more, right? Because it hasn't been molested. It's still original.
Oh, true, I suppose. Yeah.
And so look, I worked at this very high-end car collection, right? Got to do all kinds of crazy stuff. Like I don't know if this thing has come up for auction after the collection fell apart, but we had Rudolf Hess's personal 540K.
Oh wow!
All kinds of crazy stuff, like lots of pre-war rolls, the whole thing. But we had this beautiful, like green metallic E-type. I can't remember what the color is called. I want to say Millennium Jade, but that's a Nismo color, but similar. And it had these very, very delicate triple wipers in the front. And of course, it's a British car. So not only is it made of the worst metal in the world, right? Just horrible quality.
It's flimsy, poorly mounted, you know.
But it was also assembled by a couple of, North English blokes in a shed, right?
Yeah.
Like I think the old joke, right, is
By a portly man in the North Midlands. You know?
Yeah, I think the old joke about Jag is that Jag would check if their cars were correctly weather stripped by leaving a cat in it overnight, and if the cat was still there the next morning, it was good enough to ship out. So not exactly made to the highest.
Well, I was going to say, if anyone who's a Top Gear fan, like Clarkson does a whole thing about, the German and the British engineers, like, at Mercedes-Benz, we put the cat in the car, and if the cat is dead in the morning, we know that the car is appropriately sealed. And then the Englishman's like, well, up in Northern England, we put a bloody cat in the car, and if the cat hasn't escaped, we've built it properly. It's like diametrically different philosophies regarding car construction.
Yes, which is very true. And so point is, I'm detailing this because someone's come to look at it, and I decide, I'm going to do this really well. And so I go to, lean the mirrors forward so I can clean the glass. And the moment I touch the mirror, the metal is so soft, it just disintegrates and shoots springs and random parts everywhere.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, my boss was not very happy with me. But so point is, sorry, we were talking about E-types, which were, again, incredibly advanced for the time. And probably, I think, objectively, the prettiest car ever.
Up there, certainly up there.
Enzo Ferrari thought it was the prettiest car ever made.
Enzo Ferrari did say it was the prettiest car. I would. I mean, in the end, it's one of those things that's sort of like a personal taste thing. I will consider the E-type though one of like the top sort of 5 or 6 road cars in terms of both aesthetics and even I think it was a marvel for its day. And just as an aside too, like this is not a jab because I think most of our viewers know that I'm not that sort of a person. I don't take swipes off them, rarely at all. Not necessarily our own guys, but guys of our ilk who have that sort of like autistic streak, or have a passion for traditionalism, or are well acquainted with things that have like a strong sense of purpose, or that can sort of ignite emotions as such. Like, I don't understand why more of our guys like aren't into motoring and like aren't into cars and even like
I've had
racing
this conversation with
it's such a bamboozle thing. Like, I just don't get it. Like, technically speaking, because actually just with my dad, like what was it, 2 weeks ago, I sat down and watched like most of Le Mans 24 hours, which was just hosted a couple weeks ago. I'm thinking to myself, it's like, this is motor racing cannot actually be progressive, no matter how much they try and shoehorn progressivism into motorsport like they've done in every other sport. But it's just so like diametrically opposite to their actual like core presuppositions and perspectives of the world. It's like motor racing is actually very unegalitarian in many ways.
Well, it's not only inegalitarian, but it's also it's sort of it's a real dangerous thing. It's not something that can be. And obviously there have been attempts, but it's Faustian fundamentally, right? You have this constant race between designers and regulators. And, one of my favorite eras of racing, right, is obviously the 80s Group B stuff.
Oh my God.
It was just mental.
Yes.
Everything
Group
was
B
designed
rally
to kill you.
And then I was going to say Group B rally, and then like Group C, what they used to call it, like what they used to race at Le Mans, there's a word for it. Like
the 935 Porsches and stuff like that.
Group C sports car. Oh, yeah, like the Nissan. Was it the R290, and then there's a whole and the Mazda, the 787, the rotary, like just these banger after banger cars. The Jaguar too. The Silk Cut. The Jaguar was the I can't remember what model it was, but they ran like a massive V12 in it. Oh my God.
I think Speed Hunters did it like 10 to 15 years ago. There's one of those Jags in Tokyo. Like there's a collection there. And the police let them do a photo shoot. So they drove it around downtown Tokyo. You'll be able to find it from that. I think it was that Jag and then a 787. And it is one of the coolest photo shoots I've ever seen. Because again, it's like all of the iconic locations. And they drive these beautiful old race cars around. Just super cool.
XJR9, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, and it's sort of and I think you may watch more current F1 than I do. I sort of love to hate F1. That's the situation I'm in
I don't
now.
blame you. I don't blame you.
Because
Like,
they've desperately tried to
if
make it.
Max Verstappen wasn't like mogging the haters, I'd probably stop watching it.
Isn't he literally cucking one of the other drivers too?
Yeah, Daniel Kvyat, yeah, like stole his girlfriend and then like literally just had a kid with her as well. Like this year.
What a
Yeah.
Chad, based
You know what's actually
highly
funny?
autistic. Yeah.
Yeah, like because he's like Max is such a spurg as well. Like he refuses to go like movie premieres. Like there's like Lewis like dressed in like Versace and whatever. And then Max like at home on his freaking simulator. A lot of people don't know this, but Max is actually on his new. Well, he had a private jet and he upgraded when he became world champion. But on the upgraded jet, right, like at tail of his plane, he has like a racing simulator in the back of it so that he never misses because he's like a part of a thing called like Team Redline, which is like Discord is like a racing club that him and I think Lando Norris basically run, and well they don't they have people manage it, but like they're like the chief drivers in it, and they got a whole bunch of guys with them, and basically he like never misses a race because he literally has a rig in his plane. Like he's just such a spurg. I love it. He's so dedicated. And just recently, actually, just as an aside, he was, I think it was like between Grand Prix, there was like a week or two break between races just this year, and he went to the Nürburgring, as in like the original Nürburgring, the original Nordschleife, the green hell as Jackie Stewart once called it. And there was a driver that no one else, because like a GT3 competition, a bunch of streamers who do like both, like say like Gran Turismo streaming and road racing, like, who the hell is this Franz Herman? We've never heard of him before. And this guy rocks up in a helmet, a bit like the Stig from Top Gear. Helmet, doesn't talk to anyone, signs his name, goes in, jumps in a car, has never lapped the Nordschleife. Well, he's done it in like iRacing and shit heaps of times, but he's never driven his life. Jumps into a GT3 spec car, breaks the lap record by 8 seconds on the first time of asking. Like, absolute machine.
Yeah. Well,
like that's Faustian. I'm sorry, but like,
well, it is because it's singular dedication to one goal, and I mean, obviously, there have been there've been dramatic increases in safety, but it's still a very dangerous thing. Again, one of my sort of passions, obviously, is automotive and motorsport history, and I'm not necessarily a huge fan of drag racing per se. Like, I don't watch it, but I massively respect it from the perspective of
great to watch in person. I'll never watch a drag race on television in my life.
Yeah, same, right? But it was this very cool era post-war where there were all of these airstrips across the U.S. which had been converted into drag strips. Mm-hmm. And men all over the country just trying stuff. Like, what's going to work? And so there's this incredible explosion of all the technologies, we think of now, very, very early in the 50s, right? Like supercharging, obviously, had been used before on, the Duesenbergs and stuff like that. The Mercedes as well.
And you got to think with the war as well, force induction, both turbocharging and supercharging was extensively in airplanes. Go think like P-51 Mustang and
right.
The high altitude bombers, the Flying Fortress and all that was all force induction.
Well, and so you see that very quickly, like even in the old hot rods kind of throwback stuff now, right? Like the original bomber seats from a B-17 are incredibly prized because that's what you did. You'd go to a junkyard, find an old, some old warbird, throw it in. A lot of times they used the gasoline tanks, right? The streamlined pods off of Mustangs and other fighters.
The drop tanks.
Yeah. And then just strapped wheels on them. Went out to a road bed or like a dry lake bed and just drove it, 180, 200 miles an hour, basically on a bicycle. It's crazy stuff.
Of pressed sheet metal. Oh my god.
And again, a lot of these guys died, right? It was incredibly dangerous. But I mean, they were men, say what you will.
Faustian spirit, exactly. Well, it's a bit like, have you seen, I'm not one for modern movies, I find most of them detestable, but I have gone my way to watch both Ford and Ferrari, which is the one with Christian Bale and Matt Damon, and I've also seen the Ferrari movie where Adam Driver plays Enzo, and I like them both, actually. They're good movies in differing ways, but have you watched either or both of them yourself?
I have not, no.
Oh, dude, do it, right? Because there's a scene in which in Ferrari, right, where his basically testing this drive at his track, which I presume would have been like pre-Furano or pre-Mugello, somewhere like on the outskirts of what is modern day Maranello, Modena in Italy. And a driver had just deceased, and he was like looking to replace him, and he had this guy in the car, but he was kind of like the gun for the team, but he just got a girlfriend, and so like Enzo had this thing about inviting girlfriends to driving days because he's got a bit like the whole Mickey Goble thing, like women weaken legs. He's like he didn't like women being present because he distracted his drivers, and anyway, the woman arrives to watch her boyfriend drive, and like that's the day he clips a curb and kills it. Well, I don't want to say kills himself, but he perishes in the testing accident. And just see Enzo thinking, "Oh crap, another one." It's like I'm too old for this. Just the sense of resignation. But then the idea of like he goes to the bank account, the accountant, and he signs a check, gives one to the girlfriend, one to the mother, like that sort of sense of old school honor of like, well, I'm the man who put him in the machine, therefore it's my obligation to look after his family and his loved ones. And it was more of an unspoken thing back then, and I think
well, and this is something as well that we very much lost in America, is that the industrialists of the 20th century viewed themselves as having a responsibility. So look, right, like I live in an old manufacturing town.
A noblesse oblige of sorts, right?
Exactly. And funny enough, Burnham actually talks about this system falling apart kind of in the middle of the war, where he talks about the transition from capitalists to managers in the managerial revolution. And if you look at the car merchant, right, Ford, who, shall we say, had some currently controversial opinions. I'll leave it at that.
He was an author in his pastime.
He was, which of course we disavow. But point is, he had this idea that
indeed
my workers should live a good life. They should be able to afford the cars they make. And so he did all sorts of things, right? There was subsidized housing. There were all these houses over Detroit, which were produced by the Ford company. And they're still there. They're very well made. They're not, they are sort of made to a spec. But again, if your boss is giving you a house,
you might say that was simple, but not cheap. In a sense.
Exactly. That's probably the best way to say it.
Yeah.
And
I mean, not like they're made out of like plasterboard and asbestos or something. They were actually well-built houses.
Well, they were made of asbestos, as was the fashion at the time.
But you know what I mean? Like they weren't like tilt up.
Yeah. But just a brief aside, but similarly, largely because many of these men lived in communities where their workers were around. Sure, there was a huge class divide. Obviously, these men were incredibly wealthy, but they saw themselves as having a real responsibility to their people. I'm glad you mentioned Ferrari, paying for the, to the widow and mother of, the killed test driver. There's actually something very similar that happened with these, American, robber barons, quote unquote, as they've been smeared as, where if you were a driver, if you were a coachman, if you were a servant of the family and you died, the family was expected to take care of your children. And so a great number of these sort of American success stories of, poor working class kids going to prep schools and then on to Harvard was because of this system, right? They viewed themselves as having a responsibility to their nation. And these managerial capitalist types don't. They are simply stewards. They are not kings in the same way that someone like Henry Ford was. But anyway, this is very much a discussion for another time. Marcus, we're fast coming up on time. If people want to find you and your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Jeez. All of that we still missed on Teflon.
No, we didn't even bring it up.
You know what? Have you got like 2 or 3 minutes just for us to like cover Teflon since we started with it?
Here's what we'll do. I'll have you on again in a few weeks. We can discuss Teflon. And this is what we call
oh my god. I could just imagine the comments. I was like, "Oh, windbag, Furious is at it again." Came on to talk about Teflon and just talk about everything except Teflon.
we hit Roman history, cars, boomer hate, and
Italian front.
Yeah, we pretty much got everything.
Yeah. Oh well. But that's the thing, Ben. I think we enjoy talking to each other far too much. But
Yeah, to have a productive conversation. Yes.
I always have a ball on your channel, my friend, and it's been far too long. But listen, let's do this again soon, because I actually do have some downtime now that the hay is in and the sheep are shore, and I actually have a little bit of free time on my. I have some free time on my hands. So let me know. We'll do a follow up again soon. While the memory's still fresh, and we won't forget Teflon, hopefully.
All right. Sure thing, man. Obviously, I will include the links.
Sorry, just
to
to
your
say,
stuff.
just at FuriusPertinax X. I'm a bit quiet these days. I've had a lot on, but I shall be re-entering the fray. Hopefully with AM and a few other people, we'll be doing more content. So catch me around. And thank you, Burton. I appreciate it as always.
Oh, of course. And I will have those links down in the description. If you want to support the Jay Burden Show, you can do so by checking out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. JD is a unit. He's very good at what he does, and we've really grown. Right? There's a lot of guys over at Axios, so if you want to join that community, better yourself physically, it's a good way to do so. You can support us directly, which we always appreciate, or if you want to see the episodes early and ad-free, you can support us on Patreon, Gumroad, Subscribestar, and or Substack. And if you want to listen to annoying ads. Again, Marcus, I appreciate it. And everyone at home,
thank you, buddy.
Up. Oh, sure thing, man. It was a ton of fun. Keep your head up. Elia can't last forever. Good night.